I've worked security at hospitals for 8 years now, and I've seen things that would make most people quit on the spot. But what happened at Riverside General in rural Montana? I've never told anyone the whole truth. Not the police, not my family, not even the therapist I saw for 6 months afterward. Because who would believe me? Who would believe that some patients never really leave? My name is Marcus Chen, and I was the night security guard at Riverside General Hospital. It's a small facility about 40 miles outside of Billings, serving the farming communities scattered across that endless stretch of prairie. The hospital itself is old, built in the 1960s and expanded several times over the decades. But there's one section that's been sealed off since 1987. The East Wing. The East Wing used to house the psychiatric unit and some experimental treatment rooms. Management told me it was closed due to budget cuts and structural issues, but the maintenance staff whispered different stories. They said it was closed after a patient died during some kind of experimental procedure. The lawsuits were settled quietly, the wing was sealed, and everyone pretended it never existed. My job was simple: walk the active areas of the hospital every hour, check the security cameras, and make sure everything was secure. The night shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and most nights were quiet. Just the occasional emergency admission or the soft beeping of machines keeping people alive. I preferred the night shift. Fewer people, less chaos, more time to read between rounds. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was sitting at the security desk, monitoring the camera feeds, when a patient call light activated on my board. Room 237E. I stared at it for a moment, confused. The E designation meant East Wing, but that was impossible. The East Wing had been sealed for over 30 years. I assumed it was some kind of electrical malfunction. Old buildings have quirky wiring, and maybe some crossed signals were causing the alert. But when I checked the maintenance logs, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Room 237E had been disconnected from the electrical grid in 1987. The power lines to the entire East Wing had been physically severed during the closure. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I did my rounds, I found myself looking toward the East Wing entrance, a set of double doors secured with a heavy chain and multiple padlocks. The sign read, "Authorized personnel only, structural hazard." But I swear I could see light bleeding out from underneath the doors. The call light incident repeated the next night, and the next. Always room 237E, always at exactly 3:17 a.m. I started keeping a log, documenting each occurrence. The pattern was too precise to be random electrical interference. Something was deliberately activating that call button. I decided to research the hospital's history. The administrative office kept old records in the basement, and during my meal breaks, I started digging through boxes of patient files and incident reports from the 1980s. What I found disturbed me more than any ghost story. The East Wing hadn't just housed regular psychiatric patients. From 1983 to 1987, it had been home to something called Project Mindbridge, an experimental program studying consciousness transfer and memory manipulation in terminal patients. The files were heavily redacted, but I could piece together enough to understand the scope of what had been happening. Patients with terminal illnesses had been recruited for experimental procedures that promised to preserve consciousness beyond physical death. The project involved a combination of experimental drugs, electrical stimulation, and something called consciousness mapping. The files mentioned Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell as the lead researcher, but her personnel file had been removed from the archives. The experiments had apparently been unauthorized by the hospital board and conducted without proper oversight. The project was shut down abruptly in 1987 after multiple patient deaths and what the reports referred to as containment failures. Whatever that meant, it had been serious enough to seal the entire wing and bury the records. As I delved deeper into the files, the incidents at the hospital began escalating. The call light from room 237E was no longer the only anomaly. Elevators would activate on their own, rising to the 4th floor where the east wing was located. The security cameras began picking up shadows, moving through the supposedly empty corridors of the active wings. But the most disturbing development was the sound. Starting around 2 a.m., I could hear the faint hum of medical equipment coming from somewhere in the building. It sounded like ventilators, heart monitors, and IV pumps, the symphony of a busy hospital ward. But the sounds were coming from the direction of the sealed east wing. I started carrying a digital recorder during my shifts, capturing evidence of the phenomena. The recordings picked up sounds that were barely audible to human ears: whispers, footsteps, and what sounded like patients calling for help. But when I played the recordings back during the day, they contained nothing but ambient noise. The breakthrough came when I discovered a maintenance tunnel that connected the hospital's basement to the east wing. The tunnel had been overlooked during the sealing process, probably because it was hidden behind a utility panel in the boiler room. Against every instinct and regulation, I decided to investigate. The tunnel was narrow and filled with pipes and electrical conduits. I had to crawl for about 50 feet before emerging into what appeared to be the east wing's basement level. The air was stale and cold, carrying the unmistakable smell of a hospital, antiseptic mixed with something organic and unpleasant. I found myself in a corridor lined with doors marked as storage rooms and mechanical spaces, but at the far end of the hallway, I could see light bleeding out from under a door marked Treatment Room 4. The light was the pale blue-white of fluorescent bulbs, and it pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. My hands were shaking as I approached the door. I could hear sounds from inside: the steady beep of a heart monitor, the whisper of a ventilator, and underneath it all, a voice. A woman's voice, weak and frightened, saying over and over, "Please, I want to go home. Please, I want to go home." I opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been left in 1987. Medical equipment lined the walls, still connected to power sources that shouldn't have existed. But in the center of the room was a hospital bed, and in that bed was a patient. She appeared to be in her 70s, wearing a faded hospital gown, connected to machines that monitored her vital signs. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved constantly, repeating the same plea. I approached the bed, and her eyes snapped open. They were completely white. No pupils, no iris, just the milky white of cataracts. She looked directly at me and spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Marcus," she said, "you're finally here. We've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, knocking over a metal tray that clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the empty wing like a gunshot. The woman in the bed smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "Check room 237, she whispered. "Your shift is almost over." I ran. I ran through the tunnel, through the basement, up the stairs, and back to my security desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. But I had to know. I had to check the patient files for room 237E. The file was thick, filled with medical reports and test results. The patient's name was Dorothy Chen, my grandmother. She had died at Riverside General in 1987, 3 months before I was born. She had been part of Project Mindbridge. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding my own employment file mixed in with her medical records. According to the paperwork, I had been working at Riverside General not for 8 months, but for 37 years. My start date was listed as October 15th, 1987, the same day my grandmother had died. I found my own death certificate filed behind my employment records. Marcus Chen, age 34, cause of death: cardiac arrest during experimental procedure. Date of death: 3 months ago. I'm still working the night shift at Riverside General. I do my rounds every hour, I monitor the cameras, and I answer the call lights when they activate. Room 237E calls every night at 3:17 a.m., and every night I go to check on the patients who never left. The other guards who work the day shifts don't seem to notice me anymore. The nurses walk right through me in the hallways, but the patients can see me, especially the ones in the East Wing. They wave when I pass their rooms, and sometimes they ask me to sit with them for a while. Dr. Hartwell visits sometimes. She looks exactly the same as she did in 1987, still wearing her white coat, still carrying her clipboard. She tells me I'm making excellent progress, and that the consciousness transfer was more successful than she had hoped. I want to leave. I want to go home. But home is room 237E now, where my grandmother waits for me every night, connected to machines that keep something that used to be alive still moving, still breathing, still calling for help that will never come. If you ever find yourself driving through rural Montana and you see the signs for Riverside General Hospital, keep driving. Don't stop, even if you're hurt, even if someone you love needs help, because some patients never really leave. And once you're admitted, you become part of an experiment that's been running for 37 years. The night shift never ends. And now, I understand why. I was a sheriff's deputy for 15 years before I quit law enforcement altogether. People assume I left because of burnout or politics, but the truth is simpler and more terrifying. I discovered something in Blackwood County, Kentucky, that broke my faith in the justice system, in civilization, and in my own understanding of what human beings are capable of. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I need to tell someone about Highway 49, about the disappearances, about why I wake up screaming 3 nights a week, and why I moved 2,000 miles away from the mountains I used to call home. Blackwood County is rural Kentucky at its most isolated. The county seat has maybe 3,000 people, and the rest of the population is scattered across hollows and ridges that haven't changed much since the 1800s. It's beautiful country if you like mountains and forests, but it's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and secrets run as deep as the coal seams. Highway 49 runs through the heart of the county, connecting the small towns to the interstate about 60 miles north. It's a winding 2-lane road that cuts through dense forest and follows the Ridgeline for about 20 miles. During the day, it's a scenic drive. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The first disappearance I worked was Emma Walsh, a 22-year-old college student driving home to Virginia from a friend's wedding in Louisville. Her car was found at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. Engine running, driver's door open, purse and cell phone still inside. There were no signs of struggle, no skid marks, no indication of what had happened to her. Emma had vanished somewhere between mile marker 23 and mile marker 27, a 4-mile stretch of highway that ran through the deepest part of the forest. The state police brought in search dogs, helicopters, and volunteer search teams. We combed those woods for weeks, but we never found so much as a piece of her clothing. I might have written it off as a single tragic incident, but Emma Walsh wasn't the first person to disappear on that stretch of Highway 49. When I started digging through old case files, I found a pattern that chilled me to the bone. Over the previous 8 years, 11 people had vanished under identical circumstances. Always young adults traveling alone. Always between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Always between mile markers 23 and 27. Cars found running with the door open, personal belongings undisturbed, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. The official explanation was that the victims had become disoriented and wandered into the forest, where they succumbed to exposure or fell into one of the many ravines that cut through the mountainside. But 11 people? All following the same pattern? All experienced drivers familiar with mountain roads? I brought my concerns to Sheriff Davidson, a man who'd been in law enforcement for 30 years and knew Blackwood County better than anyone. He listened to my presentation with a poker face, nodding occasionally but saying nothing. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a look I'd never seen before. "Sarah," he said, "some cases don't get solved. Some mysteries are better left alone. Focus on the cases we can actually close." But I couldn't let it go. During my off hours, I started conducting my own investigation. I interviewed the families of the missing persons, drove Highway 49 at different times of day and night, and researched the history of the area. What I found disturbed me more than the disappearances themselves. The locals knew. They had always known. Old-timers in the county would lower their voices when they talked about Highway 49. They called it the Hungry Road and warned their children never to drive it alone at night. Some families had unspoken rules about avoiding that stretch of highway entirely after dark. I interviewed Martha Hensley, an 80-year-old woman whose family had lived in the county for 5 generations. She lived alone in a cabin about 2 miles from the highway, and when I asked her about the disappearances, her face went pale. "My grandfather told me about the gathering," she whispered, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Said it goes back to the first settlers. Said some folks made a deal with something that lives in these mountains. Feed it, and it brings prosperity. Stop feeding it, and..." She wouldn't finish the sentence, but she did tell me that every few years, the old families would meet somewhere in the forest to honor the agreement. She didn't know where or when, but she said I'd know it when I heard the whistling. I started staking out Highway 49 on my nights off, parking in hidden spots along the route and watching for any unusual activity. For 3 weeks, I saw nothing but the occasional late-night traveler passing through. But on the 4th week, I witnessed something that confirmed my worst fears. It was 1:30 a.m. on a Friday night when I saw the lights. Not car headlights, but lanterns or flashlights moving through the forest in a coordinated pattern. I could hear voices calling back and forth, and underneath it all, a sound that made my skin crawl. Whistling. Multiple people whistling the same tune in perfect harmony. I followed the lights deeper into the forest, staying far enough back to avoid detection. The procession led me to a clearing about half a mile from the highway, where I discovered something that still haunts my dreams. The clearing was dominated by a stone altar, roughly carved and stained dark with what I didn't want to think about. But surrounding the altar were hundreds of personal items: wallets, jewelry, car keys, cell phones, articles of clothing. I recognized Emma Walsh's purse immediately, but there were belongings that looked much older, items that could have been there for decades. I started photographing everything with my phone, but the camera flash attracted attention. I heard voices getting closer, and I realized I was about to be discovered. I ran back through the forest as quietly as I could, but I could hear pursuit behind me. Multiple people were tracking me, moving through the woods with the confidence of those who knew every tree and stone. I made it back to my car and drove away as fast as I dared on the winding mountain roads. But I had evidence now. I had photographs of the altar and the personal belongings. I had proof that something organized was happening in those woods. The next morning, I went to Sheriff Davidson with my evidence. I expected him to be shocked, to immediately organize a search of the clearing. Instead, he looked at my photographs with the weary expression of a man who was not surprised by anything. "Sarah," he said, "you need to drop this investigation immediately. Transfer to another county, or better yet, leave law enforcement altogether. There are some things in this world that are bigger than justice, bigger than the law. This is one of them." When I pressed him for an explanation, he finally told me the truth. Half the county participated in the gathering, including several members of the sheriff's department and most of the local government. The ritual had been going on for over 150 years, and it had brought unprecedented prosperity to Blackwood County. The coal mines never ran dry. The timber industry thrived when other regions struggled. Unemployment was almost non-existent. Children grew up healthy and smart. Crops flourished even during droughts, all because of an agreement made by the founding families with something that lived in the deep mountains. 11 people every 8 years, Sheriff Davidson said quietly. That's the price. 11 strangers who were passing through anyway. In exchange, 4,000 local people live good lives. Their children have futures. The math is simple, Sarah. I threatened to go to the state police, to the FBI, to anyone who would listen. Sheriff Davidson shook his head sadly. You think we're the only county with an arrangement like this? You think there aren't places all over Appalachia where people have learned to live with things that were here long before Europeans arrived? The authorities know, Sarah. They've always known. As long as we keep it contained, as long as we only take travelers who won't be missed, they leave us alone. I tried anyway. I contacted the state police, but my report was buried in bureaucracy. I tried the FBI, but my calls were never returned. I tried local journalists, but somehow my story never made it to print. And meanwhile, I was being watched. Cars followed me home from work. My phone calls were monitored. Someone had been through my apartment while I was at work. The final message came in the form of a package left on my doorstep. Inside was a photo of me sitting in my car on Highway 49, taken from close range while I was conducting surveillance. Attached to the photo was a simple note: some roads are better traveled alone. I submitted my resignation the next day and left Kentucky within the week. I moved to Oregon, changed my address, and tried to rebuild my life far from the mountains. But I still have nightmares about the clearing, about the altar, about the coordinated whistling that echoes through my dreams. If you're still listening to this story, you probably think I'm crazy or lying. That's fine. I don't expect anyone to believe me. But if you ever find yourself driving through rural Kentucky, especially at night, and you see a sign for Blackwood County, keep driving. Don't stop for gas. Don't stop to stretch your legs. And whatever you do, don't drive Highway 49 alone after dark. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. It really helps. Because some communities have learned to survive by feeding the darkness, and they've been doing it for so long that they've forgotten there was ever another way to live. The gathering still happens. The altar still gets fed. And Highway 49 still claims 11 strangers every 8 years, just like it has for the past century and a half. I've been gone for 3 years now, but I still get anonymous emails with photos attached. Pictures of the clearing, pictures of the altar, pictures of new personal belongings arranged around the stone. The most recent email contained a photo of a young man's wallet and a set of car keys. The subject line read, "Thank you for your understanding." The arrangement continues. I inherited my grandmother's house 3 years ago, and I've been trying to sell it ever since. Not because I need the money or because I don't like the property, but because I discovered that some inheritances come with responsibilities that no one warns you about. Responsibilities that have been passed down through generations and can't be abandoned without consequences that are far worse than the burden itself. My name is David Kim, and I need to tell someone about what I found in the basement of that house, about what my family has been guarding for over a century, about why I wake up every morning dreading the sound of scratching from below. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother in almost 10 years when I received the call from her attorney. We'd had a falling out when I was 18, something about family traditions and responsibilities that I'd dismissed as superstitious nonsense. She was old-fashioned, born and raised in rural New Hampshire, full of stories about things that lived in the woods and agreements that couldn't be broken. The house itself was impressive, a Victorian-era mansion built in 1887, sitting on 20 acres of forest land outside the tiny town of Millbrook. It had been in our family for 4 generations, passed down from eldest child to eldest child, along with a set of instructions that each generation had followed without question. Until me, the lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, was probably 70 years old and had handled my family's legal affairs for decades. When he handed me the deed and the keys, he also gave me a sealed envelope marked, "For David, to be opened alone." "Your grandmother was very specific about this," he said. "She wanted you to read this before you spent your first night in the house. She also wanted me to tell you that some houses aren't meant to be sold." I thought it was typical grandmother nonsense, old family superstitions, and rural folklore. I stuffed the envelope in my pocket and drove out to see my inheritance. The house was beautiful from the outside, exactly the kind of Victorian architecture that city people pay premium prices for. But it felt wrong somehow, like a beautiful mask hiding something rotten underneath. The isolation didn't help. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and cell phone service was spotty at best. I spent the first day exploring the upper floors and making notes for potential renovations. The house was in surprisingly good condition for its age, as if someone had been maintaining it carefully over the decades. But I noticed some oddities. Multiple locks on several interior doors, windows that had been permanently sealed from the inside, and a basement door that was secured with 3 different deadbolts. It wasn't until evening that I remembered the envelope. I opened it in the kitchen while eating takeout from the only restaurant in Millbrook, a diner that seemed frozen in 1962. The letter was written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "David, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the responsibility has passed to you. I know you think I'm a superstitious old woman, but some superstitions exist for good reasons. Our family has been the guardians for 136 years, and the arrangement cannot be broken without consequences that would affect far more than just our bloodline. The creature in the basement is contained, but not dead. It requires feeding every 3 days. Raw meat, at least 10 pounds, lowered through the feeding slot in the basement door. It must never be allowed to escape. The locks on the basement door must be checked every night. The symbols carved around the doorframe must be renewed with lamb's blood every full moon. I know this sounds insane, but you'll understand soon enough. The scratching will start tonight. The hunger grows stronger when there's a new guardian. Don't go into the basement for the first week. Let it adjust to your presence. But don't ignore the feeding schedule. Ever. There's more information in the leather journal hidden behind the loose brick in the kitchen fireplace. Read everything. Learn the history. Accept the responsibility, or innocent people will die. I'm sorry, David. I know you never wanted this life, but it chose you before you were born. Love, Grandmother." I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. Mental illness ran in families, and apparently my grandmother had developed some kind of elaborate delusion in her final years. I decided to spend 1 night in the house and then drive back to Boston to arrange for its sale. But that night, I heard the scratching. It started around midnight, a rhythmic scraping sound that seemed to come from directly beneath my feet. I was sleeping in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, and the sound was unmistakable. Something with claws was scratching at wood, over and over, with mechanical persistence. I tried to ignore it, but the sound continued for hours. By 3 a.m., I was wide awake, listening to the steady scrape, scrape, scrape that echoed through the old house like a heartbeat. I got up and followed the sound downstairs. It was coming from the basement door. The scratching was louder in the kitchen, accompanied by sounds that made my stomach turn. Something large was moving around down there, bumping against the walls, dragging itself across the floor. And underneath it all, a sound that barely registered as breathing. Deep, labored inhalations that seemed to go on forever. I found the journal exactly where my grandmother had said it would be. The leather was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with entries dating back to 1887. My great-great-grandfather's handwriting was almost illegible, but I could make out enough to understand the story. The house had been built around something that was already there. In 1887, my ancestor had purchased the land cheap because the previous owner had fled after his family disappeared. Local legends spoke of something that lived in the natural cave system beneath the property, something that had been feeding on travelers and settlers for decades. Rather than flee like the previous owner, my great-great-grandfather had decided to contain it. He'd built the house over the caves, sealed all but one entrance, and made an arrangement: regular feeding in exchange for containment. The creature would be fed, and it would stay in the basement. No more missing travelers. No more dead families. The journal contained detailed instructions for maintaining the containment, feeding schedules, lock maintenance, ritual renewals of the protective symbols. But it also contained warnings about what would happen if the arrangement was broken. In 1923, my great-grandfather had tried to end the arrangement by simply abandoning the house. Within a week, 7 people in Millbrook had disappeared. Search parties found remains scattered through miles of forest. Remains that showed signs of predation by something with claws longer than a man's fingers. The creature had broken free and hunted until my great-grandfather returned to resume the feeding schedule. The pattern was clear. The arrangement could not be abandoned. The responsibility passed from generation to generation because the alternative was unthinkable. I spent 3 days reading the journal, trying to convince myself it was elaborate family mythology. But the scratching continued every night, growing more agitated, more desperate. By the 4th night, the sounds from the basement had changed. Instead of just scratching, I could hear something that sounded almost like speech, a low, rumbling vocalization that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. On the 5th night, I opened the basement door. The stairs descended into darkness that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. The air was thick and warm, carrying an organic smell that reminded me of the reptile house at the zoo. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a natural cave that extended far beyond what the house's footprint should have allowed. The creature was waiting for me. I can't adequately describe what I saw. It was roughly the size of a large bear, but that's where any comparison to normal animals ended. Its body was elongated and serpentine, covered in scales that reflected my flashlight beam like black mirrors. It had 4 legs ending in claws that looked capable of tearing through steel, and a head that was almost human, except for the eyes. 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows, all focused on me with an intelligence that was terrifyingly aware. When it spoke, its voice sounded like stones grinding together. "New guardian," it said. "Hungry." Very hungry. I ran back upstairs and immediately drove to the nearest grocery store, where I bought every package of raw meat I could find. When I returned to the house, I lowered the meat through the feeding slot in the basement door, just as the journal instructed. The grateful sounds from below were almost as disturbing as the hungry ones had been. That was 3 years ago. I still live in the house, maintaining the feeding schedule, checking the locks, renewing the protective symbols. I've tried to resume my normal life, working remotely, maintaining contact with friends and family. But the isolation is taking its toll. The creature and I have developed a routine. It knows when feeding time approaches, and it shows its appreciation by keeping quiet during the day. Sometimes I catch myself having conversations with it through the basement door, discussing my day or asking about its history. It's surprisingly intelligent, and remembers details about previous guardians going back generations. It tells me stories about the early days, when it roamed freely through the forests and fed on whoever it chose. It describes the taste of fear, the satisfaction of the hunt, the loneliness of being the last of its kind. Sometimes I almost feel sorry for it. But then I remember the journal entries about what happened in 1923, about the scattered remains found in the forest, about families who disappeared without a trace, and I realize that my sympathy doesn't change the fundamental nature of what lives beneath my house. I've accepted my role as guardian, but the arrangement comes with a terrible knowledge. I'm not protecting the world from a monster. I'm protecting a monster from the world that would destroy it if they knew it existed. The creature isn't evil in any human sense. It's simply what it is, a predator that needs to feed to survive. The real horror is understanding that this arrangement exists all over the world, in remote houses and forgotten places, maintained by families who've carried the burden for generations. We're the guardians of humanity's nightmares, keeping them contained and fed so that ordinary people can sleep peacefully in their beds. I'll never have children. I'll never pass this responsibility to another generation. When I die, the arrangement dies with me, and whatever happens next will be someone else's problem to solve. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm checking the locks and listening to the creature moving restlessly below, I wonder if I'm strong enough to carry this burden for the rest of my life. And I wonder what would happen if I just walked away, left the house empty, and let nature take its course. The creature seems to sense my thoughts during these moments. It scratches more gently at the door, almost reassuringly, and sometimes it speaks to me in that grinding voice. Good guardian, patient guardian, family proud. And despite everything, despite the isolation and the responsibility and the knowledge that I'll never be free, those words comfort me. Because someone has to be the guardian. Someone has to maintain the arrangement. And for now, that someone is me. The scratching never stops completely. Even when the creature is fed and content, there's always the soft sound of claws on wood, reminding me that something ancient and hungry waits beneath my feet, trusting me to keep our agreement. Some inheritances come with money. Some come with property. Mine came with a responsibility that's older than the country itself, and I'll carry it until the day I die. The basement door is locked. The symbols are fresh. The feeding schedule is maintained. And in the darkness below, something that should not exist continues to exist, kept alive by the dedication of guardians who understand that some monsters are too dangerous to kill and too important to abandon. I've been driving trucks for 25 years, hauling freight across every highway in America. I've seen all kinds of strange things on the road. Weird weather, suspicious cargo, people who shouldn't exist. But nothing prepared me for what happened on the Ridgeline logging road in Oregon. It was a shortcut that turned into something else entirely. A stretch of highway that doesn't follow the normal rules of time and space. My name is Jake Morrison, and I need to tell someone about the woman who flagged me down at mile 23, about the 47 miles that became 1,200. About why I don't take shortcuts anymore, no matter how much time they might save. This happened in late September, during what should have been a routine haul from Portland to Sacramento. I was carrying a load of electronic equipment for a tech company. Nothing unusual or hazardous, just expensive cargo that needed to arrive on schedule. The interstate was backed up due to construction, and my GPS suggested an alternate route through the Cascade foothills. The Ridgeline logging road was marked as a state highway, but it felt more like a forgotten back road. It cut through dense forest for 47 miles, connecting to another state highway that would put me back on track to reach Sacramento by morning. The road was well maintained and clearly marked, but something about it felt wrong from the moment I turned onto it. The trees were too thick, blocking out most of the afternoon sun and creating an artificial twilight that made it difficult to judge the time. My cell phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual in mountain areas, but my CB radio was also picking up nothing but static. Even my GPS seemed confused, showing my location as a blank area with no road marked. I was about 20 miles in when I saw her, a young woman standing beside a broken-down sedan, waving frantically for help. She appeared to be in her early 20s, wearing a blue dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. Her car's hood was up, and she seemed genuinely distressed. Company policy strictly prohibited picking up hitchhikers, but this was clearly an emergency situation. She was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and it might be hours before another vehicle came along. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Thank God you stopped," she said, approaching the truck with obvious relief. "My car just died, and I've been stuck here for hours. Could you possibly give me a ride to the next town?" Her name was Lisa, and her story seemed straightforward enough. She'd been driving to visit family in Sacramento when her car started overheating. She'd pulled over to check the engine, and now it wouldn't start at all. She just needed a ride to the next service station where she could call for help. But as we talked, I noticed details that didn't quite add up. Her car was a late 1980s sedan in pristine condition, as if it had just rolled off a showroom floor. Her clothing, while stylish, had a vintage quality that seemed out of place, and her speech patterns were formal, in a way that reminded me of old movies. Still, she seemed harmless enough, and I couldn't leave her stranded in the middle of the forest. I helped her gather her purse and a small suitcase from her car, and she climbed into the passenger seat of my cab. "I really can't thank you enough," she said as we got back on the road. People these days aren't as kind as they used to be. We drove in relative silence for the next 27 miles, reaching what should have been the end of the logging road and the connection to the main highway. But instead of finding the junction, I found myself at mile marker 23, exactly where I had picked up Lisa. Her broken-down sedan was sitting beside the road with its hood up, exactly as it had been before. "That's strange," Lisa said, looking out the window at her car. I could have sworn we passed this spot already. I checked my odometer and GPS, both of which confirmed that we had traveled the full 47 miles. But somehow, we were back at the beginning of the loop. I pulled over and examined the road signs more carefully. Mile marker 23 was exactly where it should be, and the broken-down sedan was positioned exactly as it had been when I first encountered Lisa. "This doesn't make sense," I said, more to myself than to her. "We should be at the highway junction by now." Lisa seemed genuinely confused as well. "Maybe you took a wrong turn somewhere." These mountain roads can be confusing, but I knew I hadn't taken any turns. The Ridgeline logging road was a straight shot through the forest with no side roads or alternate routes. There was only one way forward and one way back, and we had definitely been moving forward. I decided to try again, thinking maybe I had misread the mile markers in the fading light. We continued down the road, and I paid careful attention to every detail: the curve of the highway, the distinctive rock formations, the pattern of the trees. Everything was exactly as it had been during our first trip. 47 miles later, we were back at mile marker 23. Lisa's car was still there, hood up, looking exactly as it had before. But now I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were tire tracks in the dirt beside the road. Fresh tire tracks from my own truck, showing where I had pulled over to pick her up the first time. "This is impossible," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Roads don't loop back on themselves." Lisa was staring at her car with a strange expression. "I remember this," she said quietly. "The engine overheating, waiting for someone to help. But it feels like it happened a long time ago." I got out of the truck and walked around the sedan, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. The license plate was from Oregon, but the registration sticker was dated 1987. The car itself looked pristine, but when I touched the hood, it was ice cold, as if the engine hadn't run in years. "Lisa," I said, turning back to her, "what year do you think it is?" She looked at me with confusion that seemed genuine. "It's 1987, isn't it?" October 15th? I checked the date on my phone. It was September 28th, 2019. That's when I started to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with the Ridgeline logging road. This wasn't just a navigation error or a problem with my GPS. We were caught in some kind of temporal loop, repeating the same 47-mile journey over and over again. I tried calling for help on my CB radio, but the static had been replaced by something worse. Voices. Faint voices calling for help, giving locations that didn't match any highway system I knew. I heard truckers reporting breakdowns and requesting assistance, but their transmissions seemed to come from different decades. "Breaker 19. This is eastbound Charlie requesting assistance at mile 31 on the Ridgeline. Engine's overheated, and I've got a load of timber that needs to be in Portland by morning." The voice was clear, but there was something old-fashioned about the terminology and accent. "This is westbound Willie. Been stuck at mile 23 for what feels like hours. Keep passing the same breakdown, same woman in the blue dress. Anyone else experiencing temporal displacement on this route?" The voices went on, dozens of them. Truckers from different eras all trapped on the same stretch of highway. Some claimed to have been driving the loop for days, others for weeks. One voice, crackling with static, claimed to have been stuck since 1962. I tried to respond, to make contact with the other trapped drivers, but my transmissions seemed to disappear into the static. The road allowed us to hear the voices of those who came before, but it didn't allow us to communicate with them directly. Lisa was becoming more agitated with each loop. Her memories seemed to be returning in fragments, and what she remembered was disturbing. "I was driving to Sacramento to start a new job," she said during our 4th trip through the loop. "But that was 32 years ago. I remember the car overheating, waiting for help. A trucker stopped and gave me a ride, but we never reached the end of the road." By the 7th loop, she was crying. "I remember other drivers now. So many drivers who stopped to help. They all got trapped too. The road keeps us driving forever." I was starting to understand the scope of what was happening. The Ridgeline logging road was some kind of temporal trap, capturing travelers and forcing them to repeat the same journey indefinitely. Lisa had been the original victim, stranded in 1987 when her car broke down, but everyone who stopped to help her became trapped in the same loop. The CB radio continued to crackle with voices from different decades, confirming my theory. Truckers, traveling salesmen, families on vacation, all trapped on the 47-mile stretch of highway, driving the same route over and over again while the years passed in the outside world. I started looking for patterns, trying to understand the rules of the trap. The loop always reset at mile marker 23, always at the exact moment I first encountered Lisa. The journey always took exactly 47 miles and brought us back to the beginning. But what happened if I refused to complete the loop? On the 10th iteration, I stopped at mile 30 and turned off the engine. Lisa looked at me with growing alarm. "Why are we stopping?" "We need to keep moving. We need to reach the end of the road." "There is no end," I told her. "We're trapped in a loop. The only way out is to find what's keeping us here." I got out of the truck and walked into the forest, looking for anything that might explain the phenomenon. About 100 yards from the highway, I found something that made everything click into place. An old logging camp, abandoned but perfectly preserved. with equipment and buildings that looked like they belonged in the 1950s. In the center of the camp was a massive tree stump, easily 10 feet across, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The symbols were old, far older than the logging camp, and they seemed to pulse with their own dim light in the forest shadows. Lisa had followed me into the woods, and when she saw the stump, she gasped with recognition. "I remember now," she said. "Before the car trouble, before everything. I was driving through here in 1987 when I saw lights in the forest. I pulled over to investigate and found this place. I touched the symbols, and then you became part of the loop," I finished. "The tree was cut down, but whatever power it contained was transferred to the symbols. The road became a trap. The symbols were clearly some kind of binding spell or containment ritual, designed to capture and hold travelers indefinitely. But rituals could be broken if you knew how. I examined the carvings more closely and found what I was looking for. A pattern in the symbols that suggested a sequence or countdown. If I could disrupt the sequence, maybe I could break the loop. Using my tire iron, I began chipping away at specific symbols, following the reverse pattern of what seemed to be the binding ritual. Lisa watched anxiously as I worked, occasionally warning me about sounds from deeper in the forest. Sounds that suggested we weren't alone in the abandoned logging camp. When I damaged the final symbol in the sequence, the effect was immediate. The forest around us began to blur and shift, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic, real traffic from the outside world. "Run," I told Lisa, grabbing her hand and pulling her back toward the truck. We made it to the highway just as the loop began to collapse. The mile markers were flickering between different numbers, and the road itself seemed to be stretching and contracting like a living thing. In the distance, I could see other vehicles, trucks and cars from different decades, all suddenly visible as the temporal barriers broke down. I started the engine and drove as fast as I dared on the winding mountain road. Behind us, the forest was dissolving into static, and I could hear the voices on the CB radio becoming clearer as the other trapped drivers found their way back to their own time periods. Mile marker 47 appeared ahead of us, and beyond it, the junction with the main highway. Real highway, with real traffic and working cell towers and GPS signals that made sense. We made it out. Lisa disappeared from my passenger seat, somewhere between mile 46 and the highway junction. I like to think she found her way back to 1987, to the life she was supposed to live. The CB radio went quiet, and my GPS started working normally again. I never reported what happened on the Ridgeline logging road. Who would believe me? A temporal loop caused by symbols carved on a tree stump? A woman from 1987 who'd been trapped for 32 years. It sounds insane even to me, and I lived through it. But I've done my research since then. The Ridgeline logging road officially exists, but it's only 12 miles long and connects 2 county highways in the Oregon Cascades. There's no record of it ever being 47 miles long, and no record of any logging operations in that area. However, there are reports of missing travelers dating back to the 1950s. People who were last seen taking shortcuts through the mountain passes, who simply vanished without a trace. The disappearances stopped abruptly in late 2019, right around the time I broke the symbols on the tree stump. Sometimes I wonder if I really escaped, or if I'm still trapped in some larger loop that I haven't recognized yet. My odometer gained 1,200 miles during that night, even though I only drove 47 miles multiple times. Time doesn't always heal wounds, and some roads don't lead anywhere except back to where you started. But I'm driving again, hauling freight across the country, following routes that GPS systems recognize and cell towers can track. I avoid shortcuts now, no matter how much time they might save. Because some roads exist outside of normal space and time, and once you drive onto them, you might never find your way back to the world you knew. The CB radio in my current truck sometimes picks up strange transmissions late at night. Voices calling for help from places that don't exist on any map. I listen to them, but I don't respond. I've learned that some people calling for help are beyond saving, and some rescues lead to becoming trapped yourself. The Ridgeline logging road is gone now, but there are other roads out there, other shortcuts that promise to save time but deliver something much worse. If you are ever driving alone at night, and you see a route that isn't on your GPS, that doesn't show up on any map, keep driving on the highway, because some shortcuts circle back to where they started, and once you're caught in that kind of loop, time becomes just another word for forever. I only worked as a substitute teacher for 1 year, but that was long enough to witness something that ended my career in education and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about childhood innocence. What happened at Millfield Elementary School in rural Iowa wasn't mass hysteria or a psychological episode. It was something far more disturbing, something that the school administration had been covering up for decades. My name is Rebecca Torres, and I need to tell someone about the second graders who spoke in unison about the man in the walls, about the drawings they made of something that shouldn't exist, about why I still wake up at night when I hear children's voices calling my name. I became a substitute teacher because I loved working with kids and needed the flexibility to care for my elderly mother. It was honest work that let me make a difference in young lives while maintaining a schedule that worked for our family situation. I had experience with children of all ages and prided myself on being able to handle any classroom situation. Millfield Elementary was a small school in rural Iowa, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and traditions went back generations. The building itself was solid mid-century construction from 1952, built to serve the farming communities scattered across the endless cornfields. It had that institutional smell that all old schools have: floor wax, cafeteria food, and something indefinable that might have been decades of childhood dreams and fears. I was called in to substitute for Mrs. Patterson's second grade class on a Tuesday morning in November. Mrs. Patterson had been teaching at Millfield for 30 years and was beloved by students, parents, and faculty. She'd called in sick, which was unusual. According to the office staff, she rarely missed work. The class roster showed 23 students, ages 7 and 8, from families I'd never heard of, but who were apparently well established in the community. When I arrived at the classroom, the children were already seated and working quietly on an assignment, which was unusual for second graders. Most kids that age are full of energy and chatter, but these children sat in perfect silence. "Good morning, class," I said, introducing myself and explaining that I'd be their teacher for the day. "Mrs. Patterson left some activities for us, so let's see what we're going to learn together." 23 pairs of eyes stared at me without blinking. 23 mouths remained closed. The silence was so complete, I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I tried various techniques to engage the students, asking about their weekend, talking about the weather, mentioning upcoming holidays. Nothing worked. They continued to sit in perfect stillness, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It wasn't until 10:30 a.m., during what should have been reading time, that the first incident occurred. All 23 students stopped their work simultaneously and turned to look at the wall behind my desk. Not just glancing, they turned their entire bodies in perfect coordination, as if responding to the same invisible signal. And then they began to whisper. The whispers were so quiet I couldn't make out individual words, but the effect was unmistakable. 23 voices speaking in perfect unison, the same rhythm, the same intonation, the same mysterious message repeated over and over. I approached the nearest student, a blonde girl named Emma, and knelt beside her desk. "What are you looking at, Emma?" I asked softly. She turned to me with eyes that seemed far too old for her 7-year-old face, and spoke in a voice that was perfectly clear. "He's in the walls again. He wants to come out and play." I looked around the classroom and realized that all 23 students were now looking directly at me, and their lips were moving in perfect synchronization with Emma's voice. "He's been waiting so long. He remembers when the school was built. He remembers the children from before." I stood up quickly, my heart racing. This was beyond anything I'd encountered in my teaching experience. Mass hysteria was a real phenomenon, but it typically involved emotional contagion and chaotic behavior. This was organized, coordinated, and deeply unsettling. "Children," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's focus on our reading assignment. Turn to page 15 in your books." But they didn't move. They continued staring at me, their lips moving in that same synchronized whisper. "He knows your name, Miss Torres. He knows you don't belong here. The children who belong here know all about him. How did they know my name?" I hadn't written it on the board, and substitute teachers weren't typically announced to students in advance, but somehow these 7- and 8-year-olds knew exactly who I was. I decided to send a student to the office for help, but when I looked around the classroom, I realized something that made my situation even worse. I couldn't tell the students apart anymore. They all looked identical. Same posture, same expression, same vacant stare. Even their clothing seemed to have become uniform, though I was certain they'd been wearing different outfits when I arrived. The whispering continued throughout the morning, occasionally stopping for a few minutes, before resuming with new messages. He built this place for the children. The old building was too small for what he wanted to do. The other teachers know. They've always known. That's why they stay. "Mrs. Patterson is sick because she tried to tell someone. The man in the walls doesn't like tattletales." During lunch break, I escaped to the faculty lounge and tried to find other teachers who might explain what was happening. But the building felt deserted, even though I could see other classes in session through their classroom windows. When I knocked on doors and tried to enter other rooms, I found them locked. I called the main office, but the phone rang endlessly without anyone answering. I tried my cell phone, but it showed no signal, even though I'd had full bars that morning. When I returned to the classroom after lunch, I found the students engaged in an art activity that I hadn't assigned. They were all drawing with black crayons, creating identical pictures with disturbing precision. Every drawing showed the same image: a tall, thin figure standing in what appeared to be school hallways, reaching out toward smaller figures that were obviously children. The figure in the drawings had no face, just a blank oval where features should have been. But its posture suggested hunger, longing, and something that might have been love, twisted into something predatory. "Who assigned this art project?" I asked, but none of the students looked up from their work. Emma, still drawing her identical picture, spoke without raising her head. "He likes it when we draw him. It helps him remember what he looks like. He's been in the walls for so long, he sometimes forgets." I gathered several of the drawings and examined them more closely. The detail was far beyond what 7- and 8-year-olds should have been capable of producing. The proportions were perfect, the perspective was sophisticated, and there were architectural details in the background that exactly matched the school's hallway layout. But most disturbing were the children in the drawings. They were all smiling, reaching back toward the faceless figure, as if welcoming its approach. "Children?" I said, raising my voice to get their attention. "I need you to stop drawing and look at me." They all stopped simultaneously and turned to face me with those identical expressions. "Who is the man in the drawings?" 23 voices responded in perfect unison. "He used to be the janitor. Mr. Hendricks. He loved the children very much. Too much. That's why they had to put him in the walls. But walls can't hold love forever. Love finds a way out. Love finds new children to care for. He's been taking care of us since we were babies. Our parents brought us here when we were little, and he's been watching us grow up. The implications of what they were saying hit me like a physical blow. I grabbed the classroom phone and tried again to call the office, but the line was dead. I tried the door, but it wouldn't open. Not locked, but somehow sealed, as if the frame had grown shut around it. I was trapped in the classroom with 23 children who were either the victims of long-term abuse or something far worse. As the afternoon wore on, the students became more animated, more willing to share details about their friend in the walls. He comes out at night sometimes, when the school is empty. He walks through all the rooms and remembers the children who used to play here. He knows stories about every student who ever attended Millfield Elementary. He remembers their names, their faces, their favorite games. Some children never left, even after they graduated. They stayed to keep him company. They're in the walls too now. The most chilling revelation came near the end of the school day. You went to school here too, Miss Torres, when you were 7 years old, in Mrs. Murphy's class. He remembers you. He's been waiting for you to come back. I had never attended Millfield Elementary. I'd grown up 300 miles away in Des Moines. But as the children spoke, I began to have flashes of memory that felt foreign yet familiar. Sitting in a classroom that looked exactly like this one, drawing pictures of a tall figure in the hallways, whispering about the man who lived in the walls. Memories that shouldn't exist, of a childhood I'd never lived. At 3:15, the school bell rang, and the students filed out in perfect formation, moving like a small army, rather than children eager to go home. As they passed my desk, each one looked at me directly and smiled, the first emotion I'd seen on their faces all day. Emma was the last to leave. She approached my desk and placed something on it before walking away without a word. It was a drawing, but not one of the group pictures from earlier. This one showed a woman who looked exactly like me, sitting at a teacher's desk, surrounded by children with no faces. At the bottom of the page, written in crayon with perfect penmanship, were the words, "Welcome home, Miss Torres." I tried to leave the building, but every exit was sealed. The hallways stretched longer than they should have, and I kept finding myself back at my original classroom, no matter which direction I walked. It wasn't until after midnight that the doors finally opened, and I was able to escape to my car. I drove straight to the school district office and demanded to speak with someone about what I'd witnessed. But according to their records, I'd never been assigned to substitute at Millfield Elementary. There was no Mrs. Patterson on their faculty roster, and my name wasn't in their substitute teacher database. When I insisted on speaking to the superintendent, they showed me my teaching certificate. The address listed my hometown as Millfield, Iowa, and my education history included attending Millfield Elementary School from 1985 to 1991. Documents I'd never seen before, describing a childhood I didn't remember living. I quit teaching that day and moved back to Des Moines, but the memories kept surfacing. Gradually, I began to remember attending Millfield Elementary, remember Mrs. Murphy's second grade class, remember drawing pictures of the man in the walls and whispering about children who never really left. I remember Mr. Hendricks, the janitor who was always kind to the students, who knew everyone's name and favorite snack, who would sometimes give special children tours of the building's secret passages. And I remember the day he showed me the space between the walls, the narrow corridors where a thin man could walk from room to room, watching and listening and caring for children in ways their parents never understood. I've tried to research what happened to Mr. Hendricks, but the school records from that period have been lost or destroyed. However, I did find newspaper articles from 1991 about a custodial worker who disappeared from Millfield Elementary. The investigation was inconclusive, but there were allegations of inappropriate conduct with students. The articles mentioned that several children claimed he hadn't disappeared at all, that he was still in the school, still taking care of them from inside the walls. If you have children in the Iowa public school system, pay attention to what they draw, what they whisper about, and who they mention as their friends. Some schools have histories that go deeper than official records, and some caretakers never really leave their posts. The Millfield Elementary incident taught me that childhood innocence is more fragile than we want to believe, and that some adults who claim to love children understand that love in ways that should never be allowed to flourish. I still have nightmares about those identical faces, those synchronized whispers, those drawings of faceless figures reaching for children who seemed happy to be reached for. And sometimes, late at night, I hear my name being called by voices that sound like children. Children who never grew up. Children who stayed behind to keep someone company in the dark spaces between the walls. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. I spent 12 years as a state park ranger, and before that, 8 years in the Marines. I'm trained to observe, to analyze, and to respond to dangerous situations with clear thinking and decisive action. But what I witnessed at Lake Ashford State Park in northern Minnesota challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world and forced me to accept that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. My name is Tom Bradley, and I need to tell someone about the swimmers who disappeared in ways that defied every drowning protocol I'd been trained to recognize. About the sonar readings that showed impossible things moving in the depths. About why the state government keeps Lake Ashford open, despite knowing exactly what lies beneath its surface. Lake Ashford is a glacial lake, formed during the last ice age, roughly circular, with a diameter of about 2 miles. The official depth is listed as 200 feet, but our sonar equipment regularly recorded readings much deeper than that, sometimes showing caverns that extended down 800 feet or more into the earth. The water is crystal clear, but incredibly cold, maintaining temperatures around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the hottest summer days. The lake attracts thousands of visitors every year, drawn by its pristine beauty and reputation for excellent fishing. But it also has a darker reputation, an unusually high rate of drowning incidents, with bodies that are rarely recovered, despite extensive search and rescue operations. During my 5 years stationed at Lake Ashford, I documented 17 drowning cases. What made these incidents unusual wasn't the number. Large bodies of water naturally have higher accident rates, but the circumstances surrounding each disappearance. Every victim was an experienced swimmer. Every disappearance occurred in calm water with excellent visibility. Every incident happened without any distress calls, splashing, or signs of struggle that typically accompany drowning emergencies. The victims simply vanished beneath the surface, as if something had pulled them down from below. The first case I witnessed personally was a 34-year-old man named David Chen, a competitive swimmer who had been doing laps along the shoreline in the designated swimming area. I was monitoring the beach from the ranger station when I saw him surface for breath about 100 yards from shore, wave to acknowledge that he was fine, and then dive back down for another lap. He never surfaced again. I immediately launched the rescue boat and reached his location within 2 minutes. The water was so clear I could see 30 feet down, but there was no sign of David Chen. I called in the state police dive team, who spent 3 days searching the lake bottom with underwater cameras and professional equipment. They found nothing. No body, no evidence of struggle, no indication of what had happened to an experienced swimmer in calm, clear water. The official report listed the causes accidental drowning with body lost due to underwater currents. But I knew Lake Ashford didn't have any currents strong enough to drag a body away so quickly. Glacial lakes are relatively static bodies of water, especially during the calm summer conditions when David disappeared. I started keeping detailed records of every incident, looking for patterns that might explain the disappearances. What I found was disturbing. The accidents always occurred in the same general area of the lake, always involved strong swimmers, and always happened during the warmest part of the day, when the water temperature differential might cause unusual thermal layers. But thermal layers don't grab swimmers and drag them underwater without a trace. I requested permission to install underwater surveillance cameras in the accident-prone area, but my superiors denied the request, citing budget constraints and liability concerns. However, they did approve my request for upgraded sonar equipment to better map the lake bottom for safety purposes. The sonar readings revealed something that changed my understanding of Lake Ashford entirely. The lake wasn't just deeper than official surveys indicated. It was far more complex. The sonar showed a massive cavern system beneath the lake floor, with passages that extended for miles underground. But more disturbing were the moving objects the sonar detected in those caverns. Large objects, very large objects, moving with purpose and intelligence through the underwater cave system. I began conducting regular sonar sweeps, documenting the movement patterns of whatever lived in the depths of Lake Ashford. The creatures, I couldn't think of them as anything else, seemed to follow specific routes through the cavern system, emerging into the lake proper during the warmest parts of summer days. Their timing coincided perfectly with the disappearances. I tried to discuss my findings with the park superintendent, but he seemed unusually reluctant to hear my theories. When I pressed the issue, he finally told me something that explained the state's attitude toward Lake Ashford's drowning problem. "Tom," he said, "some things are better left alone. The lake generates significant revenue for the state tourism industry. A few accidents every year is an acceptable price to pay for keeping thousands of families employed." But I couldn't accept that calculus. I couldn't stand by and watch people disappear just because acknowledging the truth might impact tourism revenue. I started researching the history of Lake Ashford, looking for any records that might explain what I had discovered. The earliest Native American legends about the area spoke of a water spirit that demanded tribute in exchange for allowing fishing and hunting in the region. French fur trappers from the 1700s reported that local tribes would throw offerings into the lake during certain seasonal ceremonies. But the most revealing information came from geological surveys conducted during the 1960s, when the state was considering Lake Ashford for a hydroelectric project. The surveys documented caverns that extended far deeper than current maps indicated, and they included a note that made my blood run cold. Anomalous sonar readings suggest presence of large organic masses in lower cavern system. Recommend further biological survey before proceeding with dam construction. The biological survey was never completed, and the hydroelectric project was quietly canceled. But someone in the state government had known for 60 years that something unusual lived in Lake Ashford. I decided to conduct my own biological survey, using underwater cameras and bait stations positioned near the cavern entrances. What the cameras captured over the next several weeks provided definitive proof of what had been taking the swimmers. The creature was massive, easily 40 feet long, with a serpentine body covered in scales that reflected the underwater camera lights like black mirrors. It had multiple pairs of limbs, ending in claws, that could easily grasp a human swimmer, and a head that was large enough to swallow a person whole. But the most disturbing aspect of the footage was the creature's behavior. It wasn't a mindless predator attacking random swimmers. It was intelligent, patient, and selective. The cameras showed it observing potential victims from the cavern entrances, following swimmers underwater for extended periods before choosing which ones to take. It preferred experienced swimmers, people who would dive deep and stay underwater long enough to be grabbed without witnesses above the surface seeing the attack. I compiled all my evidence, the sonar readings, the camera footage, the historical research, and the pattern analysis of the disappearances. I prepared a comprehensive report that definitively proved Lake Ashford was home to a prehistoric aquatic predator that had been systematically hunting visitors for decades. When I presented this report to my superiors, their reaction was not what I expected. "Tom," the superintendent said after reviewing my evidence, "this is excellent documentation of a phenomenon we've been aware of for quite some time. However, this information is classified at the state level and cannot be released to the public." "Classified?" I asked. "People are dying. We have to close the lake, or at least warn swimmers about the danger. The creature poses a minimal threat to the general public if proper precautions are maintained," he continued. "The number of incidents remains within acceptable parameters for a recreational water body of this size." I realized that the state government had been aware of the creature for decades and had made a calculated decision to keep Lake Ashford open. The tourism revenue outweighed the risk of a few drownings per year, especially since the creature was careful enough to avoid creating obvious evidence of predation. When I threatened to go public with my findings, I was informed that my employment contract included confidentiality clauses that would result in federal prosecution if I disclosed classified information about state park operations. I was transferred to a desert park in Nevada within the week, but I kept copies of all my research, and I've been watching the news reports from Lake Ashford ever since. The drownings continue at the same rate, 2 to 3 experienced swimmers per year, bodies never recovered, always explained as accidental drownings with environmental factors. The most recent incident was last month, a 28-year-old woman who was training for a triathlon competition. According to witnesses, she was swimming strongly in calm conditions when she simply disappeared mid-stroke. The dive team searched for 5 days and found nothing. The creature is still there, still hunting, still being protected by a state government that values tourism revenue over human lives. The underwater cameras I installed are probably still recording its activities, providing evidence that no one in authority wants to acknowledge. If you're planning a vacation to northern Minnesota and you see advertisements for Lake Ashford State Park, please consider going somewhere else. The water is beautiful, the fishing is excellent, and the recreational facilities are well maintained. But beneath that pristine surface lives something that has been feeding on visitors since before the state was officially established. The warning signs posted around the swimming area mention cold water, sudden depth changes, and general drowning precautions. But they don't mention that experienced swimmers disappear without a trace, that sonar readings show massive creatures moving through underwater caverns, or that the state has been aware of the predator for 60 years. Some parks are maintained for the public good. Others are maintained to contain things that would be far more dangerous if they were forced to find new hunting grounds. Lake Ashford remains open because closing it would force the creature to migrate to other water bodies, where the disappearances might be harder to control or explain. The current arrangement allows the state to monitor the situation while minimizing exposure to populated areas. I've accepted that I can't save everyone, but I can save a few. If even one person reads this account and decides to swim somewhere else, then breaking my confidentiality agreement was worth the legal consequences. The creature in Lake Ashford has been patient for thousands of years. It can afford to wait for the next experienced swimmer who ventures too far from shore, who dives too deep, who provides the perfect opportunity for a feeding that will leave no evidence and no witnesses. But now you know. Now you can make an informed choice about whether those crystal clear waters are worth the risk. Because some natural wonders are wonderful, precisely because they're not entirely natural. And some state parks protect things that are far more dangerous than any endangered species listed in their official wildlife guides. The lake is still there. The creature is still there. And the swimming area remains open to the public, staffed by park rangers who have been instructed not to discuss certain aspects of the lake's ecosystem with visitors. Some secrets are kept for national security. Others are kept for tourism revenue. Either way, the results for unlucky swimmers remain the same.